They called her a monster, a disfigured bride hidden behind veils and whispers. Duke Rowan Blackthorne married her to save his dying estate, expecting nothing but a cold transaction. But when he lifted that veil in the darkness of their wedding chamber, what he found wasn't a scarred victim. It was a woman with fire in her eyes and a warning in her hand. A woman who'd been hunted, and the predator was already at the gate. If you want to see how a marriage built on lies becomes the most dangerous alliance in the realm, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Let's begin. The chapel smelled of old stone and dying flowers. Rowan Blackthorne stood at the altar with his hands clasped behind his back, trying to ignore the weight pressing down on his chest. It wasn't nerves. He'd stopped feeling those years ago, back when his father had drunk away the family fortune and left him with nothing but debts and a crumbling manor that leaked when it rained. This was just necessity, cold, practical necessity. The priest droned on in a voice like gravel grinding under a boot. Rowan didn't listen. He was too busy calculating how much longer he could keep the creditors at bay, how many servants he'd have to let go by winter, whether the east wing would collapse before or after the spring thaw. The marriage would buy him time. That was all it was, a financial arrangement between two desperate families. The Vances needed respectability, something about a scandal he hadn't bothered to investigate, and he needed their money, simple, clean, emotionless. He'd been told not to expect much from the bride. "She's difficult to look at," Lord Vance had said during the negotiations, his eyes sliding away like oil on water. "An accident in her youth. She keeps herself covered. You won't be troubled by her much, I imagine. She knows her place." Rowan hadn't cared. He wasn't looking for a companion. He was looking for a solution to a problem. And if that solution came veiled and silent, all the better. Less complicated that way. The chapel doors opened. A hush fell over the handful of witnesses, mostly Vance family, a few of Rowan's remaining staff, and some local gentry who'd come to gawk at the spectacle of a duke marrying a hidden bride. Rowan heard the whispers start immediately, that familiar susurration of gossip that followed scandal like flies followed rot. "Is that her? Poor thing. He must be desperate." He turned. The bride walked down the aisle alone. No father to give her away. No attendants. Just her, moving through the shadows cast by the stained glass windows with a measured, deliberate pace that seemed almost tactical. She was covered head to toe. A heavy veil obscured her face completely, falling past her shoulders in layers of dark fabric. Her dress was simple, dark blue rather than white, with long sleeves and a high collar. Everything about her presentation screamed concealment, but her posture didn't. Rowan found himself watching the way she moved. There was no trembling, no hesitation, none of the nervous energy he'd expected from a woman being married off to a stranger. She held her head high. Her shoulders were square. Each step was precise, controlled. This wasn't a woman being led to slaughter. This was a woman walking into battle. Something flickered in his chest. Not quite interest, but close. Curiosity, maybe. Or recognition. He knew what it looked like when someone wore armor, even if that armor was made of fabric instead of steel. She reached the altar and stopped beside him. He could feel the heat of her presence, could hear her breathing steady and calm beneath the veil. Up close, he could see nothing of her face, but he caught the scent of lavender and something else, something sharp and clean, like winter air. The priest cleared his throat and began the ceremony. Rowan spoke his vows mechanically, the words falling from his mouth like coins into a well. He heard her respond in kind, her voice low and clear, completely devoid of emotion. No tremor, no warmth, just compliance. Perfect. "You may kiss the bride." Rowan hesitated for the first time. He hadn't actually considered this part. The kiss was traditional, expected, but he'd assumed it would be cursory. A brief touch of lips through the veil, maybe, or a simple skip past the custom entirely. But the priest was waiting. The witnesses were watching. He reached for the edge of her veil, intending to lift it just enough for a quick, perfunctory kiss that would satisfy protocol, without actually requiring either of them to engage. Her hand caught his wrist. The touch was firm, not aggressive, but absolute, a boundary being drawn. "Not here," she said quietly, her voice barely audible beneath the veil. Not in front of them. Rowan felt his eyebrow rise. Defiance on the wedding day. Interesting. As you wish, he said. He lowered his hand and turned to the priest. We'll observe the tradition privately. The priest looked scandalized, but Rowan didn't care. He'd already gotten what he needed from this ceremony: a legal contract, a merged estate, access to the Vance accounts that would keep his creditors from seizing Blackthorn Manor. The rest was theater. They signed the documents. Rowan's hand was steady as he wrote his name in bold strokes across the marriage contract. He watched his new wife sign as well. Her handwriting was smaller, neater, but just as confident. Lyra Vance. Lyra Blackthorn now. When it was done, they walked back down the aisle together. Rowan offered his arm out of habit, and after a moment's pause, she took it. Her grip was light but sure, and as they moved through the chapel doors into the gray afternoon light, he found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him. The wedding breakfast was a subdued affair held in the great hall of Blackthorn Manor. The room had once been impressive: high ceilings, carved beams, massive fireplaces at either end, but time and neglect had left their marks. The tapestries were faded and moth-eaten. The furniture was mismatched, pieced together from what hadn't been sold off. The whole place had the air of faded grandeur desperately trying to maintain dignity. Lyra sat beside him at the head table, still veiled, eating nothing. The Vance family occupied the seats of honor, looking uncomfortable and eager to leave. Lord Vance kept shooting nervous glances at his daughter, as if worried she might do something unpredictable. Lady Vance, a thin woman with a pinched face, didn't look at Lyra at all. Rowan watched them carefully, his years of reading people in negotiations serving him well. There was fear there. Not of him, of her. Interesting. Your family seems anxious to depart, he said quietly, leaning slightly toward his bride. They've done their duty, Lyra replied, her voice muffled by the veil but still clear. They won't linger. And you? Do you share their eagerness to be done with this? She turned her head toward him, and though he couldn't see her face, he felt the weight of her gaze. I'm exactly where I need to be, she said. The words should have been reassuring. Instead, they sent a cold trickle down his spine. Before he could respond, Lord Vance stood and cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the attention that followed. We should be going, he announced to the room. Long journey ahead. Duke Blackthorn, we trust you'll take good care of our daughter. The way he said it made Rowan's jaw tighten. There was no fatherly concern in those words, just relief. The man was washing his hands of her. She is my wife now, Rowan said flatly. She will be treated accordingly. Lord Vance nodded quickly, already moving toward the door. Lady Vance followed, without a word. Within minutes, the Vance contingent had departed, leaving behind only a few servants to collect the wedding gifts, mostly practical items, nothing extravagant, and the awkward silence of a celebration nobody had wanted. The local gentry made their excuses soon after. By evening, Blackthorn Manor was quiet again, returned to its usual state of hollow emptiness. Rowan found himself standing in his study, staring at the account books that had consumed his life for the past 3 years. The marriage had brought a substantial dowry, enough to clear his immediate debts and fund repairs to the most critical parts of the estate. It was more than he'd had yesterday, but it didn't feel like victory. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Enter. Mrs. Brennan, his housekeeper, stepped inside. She was one of the few servants who'd stayed through the worst of it, loyal more out of stubbornness than anything else. The Duchess has retired to the bridal chamber, she said. Her tone was carefully neutral, but he caught the edge of judgment underneath. Mrs. Brennan had opinions about this marriage, and she wasn't shy about letting them show through her silence. Thank you, Mrs. Brennan. Will you be joining her? Rowan closed the account book. Eventually. The housekeeper's mouth tightened, but she nodded and withdrew. Alone again, Rowan poured himself a drink, cheap whiskey, the only kind he could afford, and drank it slowly. He wasn't delaying out of reluctance exactly, more like uncertainty. This was supposed to be simple, a transaction, but nothing about today had felt simple. The way she'd walked down that aisle, the way she'd stopped his hand at the veil, the way her family had fled like criminals escaping a crime scene. Something wasn't right. He drained the glass, set it down, and made his way through the quiet halls toward the master bedroom. The bridal chamber was on the second floor, and the only wing of the manor that had been properly maintained. It was still shabby by noble standards, but at least the roof didn't leak and the fireplace worked. Rowan paused outside the door, his hand on the latch. Inside he could hear nothing, no movement, no sound. He opened the door. The room was lit by firelight, casting long shadows across the walls. Lyra stood by the hearth, still fully dressed, her veil still in place. She didn't turn when he entered, didn't acknowledge his presence at all. Rowan closed the door behind him. "We're alone now," he said quietly. "I know. You can remove the veil if you wish. There's no one here to see. Except you." He moved further into the room, keeping his distance. "I'm your husband. Whatever you're hiding, I'll see it eventually." "Will you?" The challenge in her voice made him stop. She turned then, slowly, deliberately. Even through the veil, he could feel her eyes on him, sharp, measuring, calculating. "The marriage is legal," she said. "The contracts are signed. The money has changed hands. What happens in this room doesn't change any of that." "No," Rowan agreed, "but we do have to live with each other. Some level of accommodation would be practical." "Practical." She repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "Is that what you call this? A practical arrangement? What else would you call it?" "Survival." The word hung in the air between them. Rowan studied her, or tried to. The veil made it impossible to read her expression, but her body language spoke volumes. She was tense but not afraid, guarded but not defensive. Whatever she was hiding, it wasn't vulnerability. "My family needed your money," he said bluntly. "Your family needed my name. We're both getting what we need. That's not shameful." "Isn't it?" "Not to me." She was silent for a long moment. Then slowly she reached up and began to unfasten the veil. Rowan's pulse quickened despite himself. He'd been prepared for scars, for disfigurement, for whatever accident or affliction had forced her into hiding. He'd steeled himself not to react, not to flinch, not to give her any reason to feel more shame than she already carried. The veil fell away, and Rowan forgot how to breathe. She was beautiful, not just beautiful, devastating. Her face was perfectly symmetrical, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. Her eyes were dark and intelligent, framed by thick lashes. Her mouth was full, expressive, currently set in a firm line that suggested she was used to fighting. There were no scars, no disfigurement, nothing to justify the rumors that had preceded her. She'd been hiding something, yes, but it wasn't ugliness. "You lied," Rowan said, his voice rough. "No," Lyra replied calmly. "They lied. I just didn't correct them." He couldn't look away. His mind was racing, trying to reconcile what he'd been told with what he was seeing. This didn't make sense. Why would anyone hide a face like that? Why would her own family spread rumors about disfigurement? Unless... "Who were you hiding from?" he asked. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Approval, maybe, that he'd understood so quickly. "Someone who collects beautiful things," she said quietly, "and destroys them when he's done." Before Rowan could respond, she reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it out to him. "What is this?" "Insurance," she said, "in case you decide I'm more trouble than I'm worth." He took the paper, unfolded it, and read. The words were written in the same neat handwriting he'd seen on the marriage contract, but the content was anything but neat. "I will not be controlled. I will not be hidden. I will not be treated as property. If you attempt any of these things, I will make your life more difficult than you can imagine. If you honor me as an equal, I will stand beside you. The choice is yours." Rowan read it twice, then looked up at her. She was watching him with an intensity that felt like being pinned under a blade. "You wrote this before the wedding," he said. "Yes." "You came here planning to draw a line." "Yes. Even though you needed this marriage as much as I did, especially because of that." He should have been angry, should have felt manipulated, challenged, undermined before the marriage was even an hour old. Instead, he felt something else entirely: respect. This woman had walked into a trap disguised as salvation, just like he had, and she'd done it with her eyes open and her weapons ready. "Who is he?" Rowan asked. "The man you were hiding from?" Lyra's jaw tightened. "Victor Halridge." The name hit Rowan like a fist. Everyone knew Halridge. Wealthy, powerful, connected to every major house in the region. He collected art, horses, rare books, and women. The rumors about Halridge were whispered in dark corners, never spoken openly because he had too much influence, too many allies. But everyone knew. Beautiful women entered his estate and left broken, if they left at all. He wanted you, Rowan said slowly. He decided he would have me, Lyra corrected. 3 years ago. I was 17. He came to our estate, saw me, and told my father I would make an excellent addition to his collection. Your father refused. Her laugh was bitter and sharp. My father tried to negotiate a better price. Rowan felt something cold and furious settle in his gut. I refused, Lyra continued. Halridge doesn't accept refusal well. He began to pressure my family, financial pressure, social pressure, threats disguised as friendly advice. My father was ready to hand me over within months. So you made yourself undesirable. I started the rumors myself, paid servants to spread stories about a terrible accident that had left me scarred beyond recognition. Insisted on wearing veils in public, became the tragic hidden daughter that no one wanted to look at. And it worked? For 3 years, yes. Halridge lost interest in damaged goods, moved on to other prey. But she met his eyes directly. But rumors fade. Servants talk. Veils slip. And 3 days ago, one of Halridge's men came to our estate asking questions. Rowan understood immediately. He knows. He suspects. And if he confirms it, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. So you needed to disappear into a marriage, Rowan said. Become someone else's property before he could claim you. I needed to become untouchable, Lyra corrected sharply. There's a difference. Rowan looked down at the paper in his hand at the clear, uncompromising terms she'd laid out. A practical man would end this now. Annul the marriage before it was consummated, return the dowry, wash his hands of the whole mess before Halridge came knocking. A practical man would choose survival over principle. Rowan had been practical for 3 years. It had kept him alive but left him hollow. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. You'll have your terms, he said. Lyra blinked, clearly not expecting that response. Just like that? Just like that. Why? Because I'm tired of being cornered, Rowan said bluntly. I'm tired of negotiating from weakness, of making compromises that leave me with nothing but shame. You want to be treated as an equal? Fine. I could use an ally more than I need a decorative wife. Something shifted in her expression, wariness giving way to cautious hope. And Halridge? She asked. Let him come, Rowan said, and was surprised to find he meant it. He'll find I'm not as accommodating as your father. For the first time since he'd lifted her veil, Lyra smiled. It was a small smile, guarded and testing, but it transformed her face completely. You might regret this, she said. Probably, Rowan agreed, but at least I'll regret it on my own terms. They stood there in the firelight, two strangers bound by law and circumstance, studying each other with new eyes. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of Blackthorn Manor. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the estate walls, a predator was circling, patient and hungry. But inside this room, for the first time in years, neither of them was facing the threat alone. Rowan moved to the chair by the fire and sat down, suddenly exhausted by the weight of the day. We should discuss strategy, he said. Lyra raised an eyebrow. Now? When else? Halridge won't wait politely for us to consummate the marriage and settle in. If he's already suspicious, he'll move quickly. She considered this, then crossed to the other chair and sat, her posture still perfect despite the late hour. What do you know about him? Rowan asked. More than I want to. He's 43. Widowed twice, both wives died in accidents that were never properly investigated. He owns estates in 4 counties, has investments in shipping, mining, and textile manufacturing. He sits on the King's Economic Council. Powerful. Untouchable, Lyra corrected, or near enough. The local magistrates won't cross him. The church looks the other way. And the women he ruins are either too ashamed or too frightened to speak against him. How many? That I know of? 7? That I suspect? Dozens. Rowan's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. And no one stops him. Who would? He's careful. He only pursues women from families with questionable reputations or financial troubles. Women who can't afford to make accusations. Women who disappear into his estate and emerge months later too broken to fight back. You would have fought back. Yes, Lyra said simply. That's why he wanted me. The challenge. Rowan studied her in the firelight. She spoke about Halridge with the clinical detachment of someone discussing a tactical problem, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands were folded tightly in her lap. She was afraid. She just refused to show it. He'll come here, Rowan said. Once he confirms you're not disfigured, once he realizes you're the same woman who evaded him for 3 years, he'll come to claim you. I know. And when he does, what do you expect me to do? Lyra met his eyes steadily. I expect you to choose. Choose? Between making an enemy of a powerful man who could destroy what's left of your estate, or handing me over and keeping your survival intact. The accusation in her words stung, probably because it was fair. A week ago, he might have made that choice. A month ago, he would have made it without hesitation. But something had shifted tonight. Maybe it was seeing her face and realizing she'd been punished for something that should have been celebrated. Maybe it was the note in his pocket, the clear-eyed defiance of a woman who'd been cornered but refused to surrender. Or maybe he was just tired of being the kind of man who compromised away everything that mattered. I've already chosen, Rowan said quietly. Have you? I married you. That makes you mine to protect, not his to claim. He can bring his threats, his money, his influence. It won't change the law. The law hasn't stopped him before. The law didn't have me before. Lyra laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor. You think your title will protect us? You're barely holding on to your estate. You have no political allies, no financial cushion, no leverage. No, Rowan agreed, but I have something he doesn't. What? Nothing left to lose. The words settled between them like a challenge accepted. Lyra leaned back in her chair, studying him with those sharp, intelligent eyes. You're either very brave or very stupid, she said finally. Probably both. This won't be a clean fight. Howard doesn't play by rules. Neither do I, not anymore. She was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right, if we're doing this, we do it properly. No half measures. Agreed. I need access to your accounts, your contracts, your correspondence, everything. If Halridge is going to attack, he'll look for financial vulnerabilities first. Rowan felt a flicker of old instinct, the defensive urge to protect what little privacy he had left. But he pushed it down. You'll have it. I need to know who you trust on your staff, who might be bribed or intimidated. There's only Mrs. Brennan and maybe 3 others I'd trust completely. The rest, he shrugged, desperate people make poor allies. Then we replace them. With what money? Mine, Lyra said calmly. The dowry wasn't everything I have. My mother left me a separate inheritance that my father couldn't touch. It's not vast, but it's enough to hire loyal people and shore up your most critical debts. Rowan stared at her. You've been planning this. I've been planning survival since I was 17. This is just the latest iteration. He found himself smiling despite everything. You're terrifying. Good, Lyra said. So is Halridge. We'll need to be worse. They talked through the night, mapping out strategies and contingencies like generals planning a siege. Lyra proved to have a sharp mind for tactics and an encyclopedic knowledge of Halridge's business dealings. Rowan contributed his understanding of local politics and the legal frameworks that might be twisted into weapons. By the time dawn light began filtering through the windows, they had the beginnings of a plan. It wasn't perfect. It relied on assumptions and timing that could easily fail. But it was more than either of them had walked into that chapel with. As the room brightened, Lyra stood and moved to the window, looking out over the gray landscape of Blackthorn Manor's grounds. It's not much, is it? She said quietly. No, Rowan admitted, joining her at the window. But it's mine, and I'll burn it to the ground before I let Halridge take it. She glanced at him sidelong. You'd really do that? Destroy everything you've been trying to save? If the alternative is surrendering to men like him, yes. Lyra turned to face him fully, and for the first time since he'd lifted her veil, she looked uncertain. I didn't expect you to be like this, she said. Like what? Honest. The word hit harder than it should have. I've spent 3 years lying to creditors and pretending I had control, Rowan said. I'm tired of it. Whatever else this marriage becomes, it should at least be honest. Lyra studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. All right, she said. Honesty. No masks. No masks, Rowan agreed. They stood there in the growing light, two people who'd entered a marriage expecting nothing and finding instead the dangerous possibility of something more. Outside, the grounds of Blackthorn Manor stretched away into morning mist. Somewhere beyond those boundaries, Victor Halridge was moving pieces into position, preparing to claim what he believed was his. But inside these walls, an alliance was being forged, fragile, untested, but sharp enough to draw blood. The war was coming, and for the first time in years, Rowan Blackthorn felt ready to fight. The first servant Rowan fired was Thomas Hendry, the groundskeeper who'd been with the estate for 12 years. He did it 3 days after the wedding, in the cold morning light of the stable yard, with Lyra standing beside him. "You're letting me go?" Hendry's face went red, his hands curling into fists. "After everything I've done for this place? After I stayed when everyone else ran?" "You stayed because no one else would hire you," Rowan said flatly. "And yesterday you accepted 20 silver from a man in a gray coat who asked questions about my wife." The color drained from Hendry's face. "I don't know what you're—" "The stable boy saw you," Lyra cut in, her voice sharp as broken glass. "He also heard you describe me in detail, down to the color of my eyes and the shape of my face. Strange, considering I've been veiled in public since I arrived." Hendry's mouth worked soundlessly. "Get out," Rowan said. "Be grateful I'm not having you arrested for espionage." The groundskeeper left cursing, his threats echoing across the courtyard until the gate slammed shut behind him. 2 other servants followed within the hour, a housemaid and a cook's assistant, both caught taking money from the same gray-coated stranger. Mrs. Brennan stood in the kitchen doorway watching it all with grim satisfaction. "About time you grew teeth," she said when the last of them had gone. "This place has been bleeding information for years." "Can we function with half a staff?" Rowan asked. "We've been functioning with half a staff for months," the housekeeper replied. "The difference is now the people left are actually working instead of selling gossip to your creditors." Lyra had been quiet through most of the dismissals, but now she spoke up. "We'll need replacements. People with no ties to the region, no loyalty to Halridge or anyone in his network." "That'll cost money," Mrs. Brennan pointed out. "I have money," Lyra said. "What I don't have is time. Halridge knows I'm here. He knows what I look like. The only question is when he'll make his move." She was right, and they all knew it. That night, Rowan sat in his study reviewing the ledgers Lyra had requested. She'd spent the afternoon going through 3 years of accounts, with the focus of a huntress tracking prey, marking entries with small notations in the margins. "You've been hemorrhaging money to the same creditor for 18 months, she said, tapping one particular line. "Edmund Caro. He's charging you nearly double the standard interest rate." "I know," Rowan said tiredly. "He's the only one who would lend to me after my father died. He's also Halridge's brother-in-law." The words landed like a hammer. Rowan looked up sharply. "What?" Lyra turned the ledger toward him, pointing to the signature. "Edmund Caro married Halridge's younger sister 9 years ago. They live on an estate 40 miles from here. Every pound you've paid him has been reported directly to Halridge." The implications crashed over Rowan like cold water. His financial situation wasn't just known to Halridge, it had been orchestrated by him. "He's been positioning himself," Lyra continued, her voice steady but her eyes hard. "Keeping you weak enough to manipulate, but not so broken you'd lose the estate entirely. When he decided he wanted me, he would have offered to clear your debts in exchange for cooperation." "He would have bought me," Rowan said slowly. "He would have tried." Rowan stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Rage, clean and bright, burned through the exhaustion he'd been carrying for months. "How long have you known about this?" "I suspected when I saw Caro's name in your records," Lyra admitted. "I confirmed it this afternoon. Mrs. Brennan has a nephew who works in the records office in town. He pulled the marriage certificates for me." "You should have told me immediately. I needed to be sure. Accusations without evidence are just noise." She was right, but it didn't make the betrayal sting less. Rowan moved to the window, staring out at the dark grounds. Somewhere out there, Halridge was watching, waiting, pulling strings Rowan hadn't even known existed. "What do we do?" he asked. "We cut the strings," Lyra said simply. "Tomorrow, we visit Caro and pay off the debt in full, every penny. Then we make it very clear that any future dealings with him will be through lawyers, in writing, with witnesses present. That'll make him angry. Good. Angry people make mistakes. Rowan turned back to her. She was sitting at his desk like she'd been born to it, surrounded by papers and ledgers, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. She'd stopped wearing the veil inside the manor, and the change was startling. Without it, she was even more striking and more dangerous. "You're enjoying this," he said. "I've spent 3 years hiding," Lyra replied. "Fighting back feels better than I remembered." The next morning, they rode out to Caro's estate with 2 hired guards, men Lyra had found through contacts in town, veterans with no love for local nobility and no history with Halridge. Edmund Caro received them in a parlor that reeked of old money and new polish. He was a soft man with calculating eyes, the kind who smiled while gutting you. "Duke Blackthorn," he said warmly, standing to greet them, "and the new Duchess. What an unexpected pleasure." "This isn't a social call," Rowan said, handing over a sealed envelope. "That's payment in full for the outstanding loans, plus interest calculated at the legal rate, not the extortionate rate you've been charging." Caro's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went cold. He opened the envelope, scanned the contents, and set it aside carefully. "I see. And the source of these funds?" "Irrelevant," Lyra said before Rowan could answer. "The debt is cleared. You'll provide a receipt and a signed statement that no further obligations exist between you and the Blackthorn estate." "Of course," Caro said smoothly. "Though I must say this seems rather sudden. If you'd come to me with difficulties, we could have worked out more flexible arrangements." "We're not interested in flexibility," Rowan said. "We're interested in ending our business relationship, permanently." Something shifted in Caro's expression. A flicker of irritation quickly masked. "As you wish. Though I should warn you, Duke Blackthorn, that burning bridges in your position is unwise. You may find you need friends sooner than you think." "Then it's fortunate I'm learning to choose them more carefully," Rowan replied. They left with the receipt and the signed documents, Caro's false smile following them to the door. On the ride back, Lyra was quiet. "That was easier than it should have been," she said finally. "You think he'll retaliate?" "I think he'll report to Halridge immediately," Lyra said. "Which means we've just accelerated the timeline." She was right. 2 days later, Victor Halridge arrived at Blackthorn Manor. He came at midday when the sun was high and there was no darkness to hide in. His carriage was black and polished, pulled by 4 matched grays that probably cost more than Rowan's entire stable. 6 outriders accompanied him, armed and wearing Halridge's colors. Rowan watched from the study window as the procession rolled up the drive. "He's here!" he called. Lyra appeared beside him, her face unreadable. She'd known this was coming, had prepared for it, but Rowan could see the tension in her shoulders. "How do you want to handle this?" he asked quietly. "Together," she said. "He expects me to hide or you to hand me over. We do neither. He'll be charming at first, he always is. Then we'll be polite, until we're not." They met Halridge in the entrance hall. He was exactly what Rowan expected, tall, well-dressed, handsome in the way expensive grooming could make a man handsome. His smile was practiced and warm, his movements smooth and confident. Everything about him screamed predator. "Duke Blackthorn," Halridge said, extending his hand. "Thank you for receiving me on such short notice." Rowan shook his hand briefly. The grip was firm, measuring. "Lord Halridge, to what do we owe the pleasure? I heard rumors of your recent marriage and wanted to offer my congratulations in person." His eyes slid to Lyra, who stood beside Rowan with her chin raised and her hands folded calmly. "And to finally meet the Duchess. I've heard so much about you, Lady Blackthorn." "Have you?" Lyra's voice was cool. "How interesting. We've only been married a week." "Ah, but I've known of you for years. Your father and I are acquainted." "We're acquainted," Lyra corrected. "I'm no longer my father's concern." Halridge's smile widened. "Of course. Forgive me. Marriage does change things, doesn't it?" There was something underneath his polite words, a current of ownership, of challenge. Rowan felt his hackles rise. "Would you like tea?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Or is this a brief visit?" "Tea would be lovely," Halridge said. "I do hope we can speak candidly. I have a proposition that might interest you both." They moved to the drawing room. Mrs. Brennan brought tea with a face like stone, her disapproval radiating from every movement. Halridge settled into the best chair like he owned it. Your estate is impressive, he said, looking around at the faded wallpaper and worn furniture. Historic. It has potential. It serves its purpose, Rowan said. With the right investment, it could be remarkable. In fact, I've been considering expanding my holdings in this region. I could offer very favorable terms, enough to restore Blackthorn Manor to its former glory. We're not interested in selling, Rowan said flatly. Not selling, Halridge corrected smoothly. Partnership, a merger of interests. Your family name carries weight, Duke Blackthorn. Combined with my resources, we could accomplish remarkable things. And what would you want in return? Halridge's eyes drifted to Lyra. Access, influence, a closer connection between our families. The implication was clear as broken glass. Lyra set down her teacup with deliberate care. I'm afraid you've wasted a trip, Lord Halridge. We're not interested in partnerships or connections. Our interests are our own. Are they? Halridge's tone remained pleasant, but something cold crept into his eyes. I wonder if you've fully considered your position, Lady Blackthorn. You've traded one difficult situation for another. Your husband's debts may be temporarily settled, but his reputation is still precarious. Rumors are powerful things. They can build a man up or tear him down. Is that a threat? Rowan asked quietly. A concern, Halridge replied. I'd hate to see either of you suffer unnecessarily, especially you, Duchess. I remember your father mentioning some unfortunate circumstances that forced you into seclusion. It would be tragic if those circumstances became public knowledge. Lyra's face could have been carved from ice. My circumstances are no longer my father's to discuss. Perhaps not, but memories linger. People talk. And in my experience, secrets have a way of surfacing at the most inconvenient times. Rowan stood. I think this conversation is over. Halridge remained seated, his smile never wavering. Think carefully, Duke Blackthorn. I'm offering friendship, protection. The alternative is considerably less pleasant. The alternative is you leaving my home, Rowan said, his voice hard. Now. For a moment, Halridge's mask slipped. The smile remained, but his eyes went flat and dangerous, the look of a man who wasn't used to being refused. Then he stood, smoothing his coat. As you wish. But when circumstances change, and they will, my offer will still stand. For a time. He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at Lyra. You were always going to be mine, he said softly. Hiding only delayed the inevitable. Running won't change it. I'm not running, Lyra said, her voice steady despite the fury in her eyes. I'm married, legally and binding. You have no claim. We'll see, Halridge said. And then he was gone, his carriage rolling back down the drive with an unhurried confidence that made Rowan's blood boil. Lyra didn't move until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. That, she said quietly, was a declaration of war. I know. He won't stop. He'll use every resource he has to break us apart. Let him try. Lyra turned to him, her expression fierce. You don't understand what he's capable of. He destroyed the merchant's daughter when she refused him, drove her family into bankruptcy and her into a convent. He orchestrated the Ashford scandal that ruined 3 generations of their line. He's patient and ruthless, and he always wins. He hasn't won yet, Rowan pointed out, only because he hasn't committed fully. That visit was him testing our defenses, seeing how we'd respond. Now he knows we won't surrender quietly. That makes us a problem he'll need to solve. Rowan moved to the window, watching the last of Halridge's outriders disappear through the gates. Good, he said. Good? I'm tired of being the kind of man who surrenders. If he wants a fight, he'll get one. Lyra was quiet for a long moment. Then she crossed to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his. This is going to get ugly, she said. I know. We could lose everything. I know that too. Then why? Because some things are worth losing everything for, Rowan interrupted, looking at her directly. And I'm done pretending otherwise. Her breath caught, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely surprised. Before either of them could say more, Mrs. Brennan appeared in the doorway, her face grim. You need to see this, she said, holding up a letter. It came while that snake was here. One of his riders left it with the stable boy. Rowan took the letter. It was addressed to him in elegant script, sealed with Halridge's mark. He broke the seal and read. The words were polite, formal, completely proper, but the content made his stomach turn. Halridge was calling in a legal claim, an old debt from Rowan's father, backed by documentation and witnesses, demanding immediate payment of a sum that would bankrupt the estate twice over. It's fabricated, Lyra said, reading over his shoulder. It has to be. Probably, Rowan agreed. But if he has false documents that look real, if he's bribed the right people to testify, the courts will rule in his favor, Lyra finished. And when you can't pay, he'll seize the estate. And you with it. They stared at each other, the weight of the trap settling over them. How long do we have, Lyra asked. Rowan checked the letter again. He's demanding a response within 10 days. After that, he'll file with the magistrate. 10 days, Lyra repeated. That's not enough time to fight this legally. No, Rowan agreed. It's not. But something was forming in his mind. Not a plan exactly, but the skeleton of one. Halridge had shown his hand too quickly, pushed too hard. Men who pushed that hard usually had a weakness they were trying to hide. We need to find out what he's afraid of, Rowan said slowly. What do you mean? He came here personally. He made threats. He's moving fast and aggressive. That's not the behavior of a man who's confident. It's the behavior of a man who's worried we might find something he doesn't want found. Lyra's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. You think he's vulnerable? I think everyone's vulnerable. We just need to find where. And how do we do that in 10 days? Rowan turned to Mrs. Brennan, who'd been listening with sharp attention. Your nephew, he said, the one who works in the records office. Can he be trusted? With his life, Mrs. Brennan said immediately. Then we need him to pull every record connected to Halridge. Property transactions, marriage certificates, business licenses, lawsuits, everything. If there's something hidden, it'll be in the paperwork. That's a lot of records, Mrs. Brennan warned. Then we'll need help, Lyra said. She was already moving toward the desk, pulling out paper and ink. I have contacts, people who owe me favors or hate Halridge enough to risk helping. We can have teams searching by tomorrow. Halridge will notice, Rowan said. Let him, Lyra replied, her voice hard. He declared war. Time to show him we know how to fight. The next 8 days were a blur of desperate activity. Mrs. Brennan's nephew and his friends combed through records. Lyra's contacts, a network of displaced servants, disgraced merchants, and ruined families who'd all been touched by Halridge's influence, fed them information in whispers and coded letters. Rowan barely slept, spending his nights cross-referencing documents and his days interviewing anyone who might have useful knowledge. They found pieces of the puzzle. Halridge's first wife had died in a riding accident, but 3 servants from that estate had disappeared immediately afterward and were never heard from again. His second wife had drowned, but the local doctor who examined her body had fled the region within days and now lived under an assumed name. Financial records showed patterns of manipulation. Debts called in at strategic moments, properties acquired at suspicious prices, business rivals who'd mysteriously lost everything. But nothing concrete, nothing that would stand up in court against a man with Halridge's resources and influence. On the 8th day, with 2 days left before the deadline, Lyra found it. She came to the study at midnight, her eyes bright with exhaustion and triumph. I have it, she said. Rowan looked up from the documents he'd been reviewing. Have what? Proof. Real, documented proof that Halridge forged the debt claim against your father. She spread papers across the desk. Letters, receipts, testimony from a clerk who'd been paid to backdate documents. This clerk, Rowan said, scanning the papers, he'll testify? He's dying, Lyra said bluntly. Consumption. He has maybe 6 months. Halridge can't threaten him anymore, and he wants to clear his conscience before the end. Rowan felt hope flare for the first time in days. This could work. It will work. With this testimony and these documents, we can prove the claim is fraudulent. The magistrate will have to dismiss it. Halridge won't accept that quietly. No, Lyra agreed, but it buys us time. And once we expose one fraud, people will start questioning everything else he's done. Rowan stood and pulled her into an embrace before he could think better of it. She stiffened for a moment, then relaxed against him. We're going to survive this, he said quietly. Yes, Lyra replied. We are. But even as he held her, Rowan felt the weight of what was coming. Halridge wouldn't stop at legal maneuvers. Men like him didn't quit when their first plan failed. They escalated. And escalation meant danger. The knock came just before dawn. Rowan woke to pounding on the bedroom door and Mrs. Brennan's urgent voice. Duke Blackthorne, wake up! He was on his feet instantly, grabbing a robe. Beside him, Lyra was already awake, her hand reaching for the knife she kept under her pillow. What is it? Rowan called. Fire, Mrs. Brennan said through the door. The east stable's burning. They ran. By the time they reached the courtyard, flames were already consuming the stable building, orange light dancing against the pre-dawn darkness. The few remaining servants were fighting the blaze with buckets, but it was spreading too fast. The horses, Lyra said, already running toward the building. Rowan caught her arm. It's too dangerous. There are 6 animals in there. Before he could stop her, she pulled free and plunged through the smoke-filled entrance. Rowan cursed and followed. Inside was chaos. Heat and smoke made breathing nearly impossible. He could hear horses screaming, their terror cutting through the roar of flames. Lyra had already reached the first stall, throwing it open and driving the panicked mare toward the exit. Rowan grabbed another horse, a gelding that tried to rear but was too frightened to fight effectively. They worked together, releasing animal after animal, driving them out into the courtyard where the servants caught them and led them to safety. The last horse was trapped in a stall at the back, where the fire had already reached the support beams. Rowan could see the structure starting to sag. Leave it! He shouted to Lyra. She ignored him, moving toward the stall. The beam gave way with a crack like thunder. Rowan didn't think. He lunged forward, grabbed Lyra around the waist, and threw both of them backward as burning wood crashed down where she'd been standing. They hit the ground hard, smoke choking them. Above, the roof groaned ominously. Move! Rowan gasped, dragging her toward the exit. They stumbled out into the courtyard just as the entire structure collapsed behind them, sending up a shower of sparks into the lightning sky. Lyra was coughing violently, her face smudged with soot. Rowan's lungs burned, and he could feel burns on his arms where embers had caught him. But they were alive. The last horse, Lyra said between coughs. Is dead, Rowan said flatly. And we almost were too. She looked back at the burning ruins, grief and fury warring in her expression. Mrs. Brennan appeared with blankets and water. Anyone hurt? Minor burns, Rowan said. Nothing serious. How did this start? The housekeeper's face was grim. Stable boy says he smelled lamp oil before he saw the flames. This wasn't an accident. Of course it wasn't. Halridge's response to their defiance had arrived. Rowan looked at Lyra, seeing his own anger reflected in her eyes. He's escalating, she said quietly. Then so do we, Rowan replied. As the sun rose over Blackthorn Manor, painting the smoke and ash in shades of red and gold, Rowan made a decision. No more defense. No more reaction. It was time to take the fight to Halridge directly. And if that meant risking everything they'd built, so be it. Some battles were worth fighting, even when you knew the cost might be everything you had left. The ashes were still warm when Rowan made the call. He stood in what remained of the stable yard, his burns wrapped in rough bandages, watching the hired guards sift through debris for evidence they already knew they'd find. Lamp oil. Deliberate placement. Professional work. Lyra appeared beside him, her face cleaned of soot, but her eyes still burning with something hotter than the fire that had nearly killed them. We need witnesses, she said quietly. People Halridge can't intimidate or buy off. There aren't many of those left in this region, Rowan replied. Then we bring them from outside. She turned to face him fully. We make this public. Invite the magistrate, the tax collectors, representatives from the King's Council. We force Halridge to operate in daylight instead of shadows. That's dangerous. Everything's dangerous now, Lyra said. At least this way, if he moves against us, he'll have to do it in front of people who matter. Rowan considered it. The plan had teeth, sharp ones, but it also meant gambling everything on a single moment, a single confrontation that could either expose Halridge or destroy them completely. When? He asked. Tomorrow. Before he can regroup or plan something worse than arson. Tomorrow, Rowan repeated. The word tasted like steel. All right, let's do it. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Mrs. Brennan dispatched riders to every corner of the region, carrying formal invitations to what Rowan called a resolution hearing regarding Lord Halridge's legal claim against the Blackthorn estate. The language was careful, official, impossible to ignore without admitting you were avoiding scrutiny. Lyra worked on gathering the evidence, the clerk's testimony, the forged documents, the financial records that showed Halridge's pattern of manipulation. She organized everything into a presentation that even a reluctant magistrate couldn't dismiss. Rowan handled the physical preparations. He had the great hall cleaned and arranged like a courtroom, with chairs for witnesses and observers, a table for documents, space for everyone to see and hear clearly. No shadows. No hiding. By nightfall, the invitations had been delivered. By midnight, responses started arriving. The magistrate would attend. He had no choice once it became a public matter. 2 representatives from the King's Economic Council confirmed their presence, likely out of curiosity more than duty. A handful of local gentry accepted, probably hoping to witness either Rowan's vindication or his destruction. And Halridge sent word that he would be there personally. "He's confident," Lyra said, reading his response. "He thinks he can control this." "Can he?" Rowan asked. "Not if we're faster." They didn't sleep that night. Instead, they sat in the study going over every detail, every possible argument Halridge might make, every weakness in their evidence that needed reinforcing. "He'll try to discredit the clerk," Lyra said, pacing. "Call him a liar or a madman. We need to establish his credibility first." "The clerk worked for the records office for 20 years, Rowan pointed out. "He has no criminal history, no reason to fabricate this except wanting to clear his conscience." "Halridge will say you paid him. Then we show he's dying. A man with months to live doesn't risk his soul for money." Lyra stopped pacing and looked at him. "You're good at this." "At what?" "Strategy. Fighting. You've been playing defense for so long I don't think you remembered you could attack." Rowan felt something shift in his chest. Pride, maybe, or just recognition. She was right. He'd spent years reacting, compromising, surviving. He'd forgotten what it felt like to actually fight for something. "I had a good teacher," he said, gesturing to the organized chaos of evidence she'd assembled. "I'm not teaching you," Lyra replied. "I'm just reminding you of what you already knew." The moment stretched between them, heavy with things neither was ready to say out loud. Then Mrs. Brennan knocked, breaking the spell. "The clerk's here," she announced, and he brought company. They found the clerk in the entrance hall, a thin man in his 50s with the gray pallor of serious illness, leaning heavily on a cane. But beside him stood 3 other people, all dressed in servants' clothing, all looking terrified but determined. "Who are they?" Rowan asked. "Rowan Seat." The clerk coughed wetly before answering. "Former staff from Halridge's estate. They contacted me after they heard what I was doing. They want to testify." Lyra stepped forward, studying the 3 newcomers. "About what?" A woman in her 40s spoke up, her voice shaking but clear. "About what happened to Lady Margaret, Lord Halridge's first wife. I was her lady's maid. I saw what he did to her." The words fell like stones into deep water. Rowan exchanged a glance with Lyra. This was bigger than they'd expected, and infinitely more dangerous. "Come inside," he said. "All of you. We need to hear everything." They gathered in the study. Mrs. Brennan brought tea that no one touched. The servants sat huddled together, drawing courage from each other's presence. The lady's maid spoke first. Her name was Sarah Whitmore, and she'd served Margaret Halridge for 6 years before the woman's death. "She was kind," Sarah said quietly. "Gentle." But Lord Halridge broke her slowly. First it was criticism, her appearance, her conversation, the way she managed the household. Then it was isolation. He sent away anyone she was close to, replaced them with his own people. By the end, she barely left her chambers. "How did she die?" Lyra asked gently. "They said it was a riding accident, but Lady Margaret hated riding. She was terrified of horses after a childhood fall. She never would have gone riding alone." "Are you saying he killed her?" Sarah's hands twisted in her lap. "I'm saying she was dead the morning after I heard them arguing. I'm saying there was a bruise on her throat that wasn't in the official report. And I'm saying 3 of us who questioned it were dismissed within days and threatened if we ever spoke about it again." The other 2 servants nodded confirmation. A man who'd been a groundskeeper spoke next. "I saw Lord Halridge lead a horse back to the stable that morning. Its legs were clean, no mud, no sign it had been ridden hard. But they said Lady Margaret's horse had bolted and thrown her miles from the estate. The third servant, a young woman who'd worked in the kitchen, added, "The night Lady Margaret died, Lord Halridge had visitors, men I'd never seen before. They left before dawn carrying something wrapped in cloth. I thought it was carpet being removed for cleaning, but—" She trailed off, looking sick. Rowan felt cold fury settling in his bones. This wasn't just manipulation or intimidation. This was murder. "Why didn't you go to the authorities?" he asked. "We tried," Sarah said. The magistrate at the time was Lord Halridge's cousin. Our statements were taken and then destroyed. We were told if we persisted, we'd be charged with slander and imprisoned. "So you stayed silent?" "We survived," Sarah corrected sharply. "We did what we had to do to survive, just like everyone else who crosses paths with that man." Lyra had been quiet through all of this, her face carefully neutral, but Rowan could see the tension in her shoulders, the white-knuckled grip on the arm of her chair. "Will you testify tomorrow?" she asked. "Publicly? In front of witnesses?" Sarah looked at her companions. They nodded, one by one. "Yes," she said, "we'll testify." "It'll destroy your lives," Rowan warned. "Halridge won't let this go unanswered." "Our lives are already destroyed," Sarah replied. "We've been running for 10 years. Maybe it's time to stop." After they'd been shown to guest rooms, Rowan and Lyra sat in the study staring at each other. "This changes everything," Lyra said. "I know. If we accuse Halridge of murder in front of the king's representatives, there's no going back. He'll either be destroyed or he'll destroy us trying to silence this." "I know that too." Lyra stood and moved to the window, her silhouette sharp against the darkness outside. "We could still back away. Use just the fraud evidence, expose the fake debt, and leave the murder accusations alone. It would be safer." "Would it?" Rowan challenged. "Or would it just give him time to eliminate these witnesses and come after us again?" "Probably," Lyra admitted. "Then we go all in. Tomorrow, in front of everyone who matters, we burn his entire world down." She turned to look at him. "You understand what you're risking? Your reputation, your estate, possibly your life?" "Yes." "Why?" Rowan stood and crossed to her. "Because I'm tired of men like Halridge winning. Because your life matters more than my comfort. And because if I'm going to lose everything anyway, I'd rather lose it fighting than cowering." Lyra's breath caught. For a moment, she looked young and vulnerable in a way he'd never seen before. "I didn't expect you to be brave," she said quietly. "I didn't expect you to be worth being brave for," Rowan replied. The words hung between them, raw and honest. Then Lyra reached up and kissed him. It wasn't gentle or practiced. It was desperate and fierce, the kiss of two people who'd been alone too long and had finally found someone worth standing beside. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Lyra rested her forehead against his. "Tomorrow might destroy us," she whispered. "Then let's make tonight count," Rowan replied. They didn't make it to the bedroom. The study floor would have to do. Morning came too quickly. By 9 o'clock, the great hall was filled with witnesses and observers. The magistrate sat at the head table looking deeply uncomfortable. The two kings' representatives flanked him, their expressions carefully neutral. Local gentry filled the remaining seats, whispering behind their hands. Rowan and Lyra stood at the center of it all, presenting their case like prosecutors at trial. The clerk testified first, his voice steady despite his illness. He described in detail how Halridge had paid him to create false documents, to backdate contracts, to fabricate a debt that never existed. "Why did you agree?" the magistrate asked. "Because I was afraid," the clerk said simply. "Lord Halridge made it clear what would happen to my family if I refused. But I'm dying now, and I won't meet my end with this lie on my conscience." The magistrate examined the forged documents, comparing them to genuine records. Even he couldn't deny the discrepancies. Then Sarah Whitmore took the floor. The room went deathly silent as she described Margaret Halridge's final days. The isolation, the bruises, the suspicious death, the threats that followed. "This is slander!" someone shouted from the back, one of Halridge's supporters. But Sarah didn't stop. The groundskeeper testified next, then the kitchen maid. Their stories corroborated each other perfectly, too detailed and consistent to be fabrication. The king's representatives leaned forward, suddenly very interested. "These are serious accusations," one of them said. "Do you have any physical evidence?" We have testimony from multiple witnesses, Lyra replied. We have records showing 3 servants were dismissed and paid off immediately after Lady Margaret's death. We have documentation that the original magistrate who handled the case was Lord Halridge's cousin and has since fled the region. That's circumstantial. Then order an exhumation, Rowan said. Examine Lady Margaret's body. If she died from a riding accident as claimed, the evidence will show it. If she was murdered, that will show too. The magistrate looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. That's a very serious step to take based on the testimony of servants. Then dismiss the case, Rowan challenged. Tell the king's representatives that you refuse to investigate credible murder accusations because the accused is wealthy and influential. I'm sure that will reflect well on your competence. The magistrate's face went red, but before he could respond, the doors to the great hall slammed open. Victor Halridge strode in, flanked by 6 armed men. The room erupted in chaos. This hearing is illegitimate, Halridge announced, his voice cutting through the noise. These accusations are fabrications designed to extort money from me. I demand this proceeding be stopped immediately. You're not in a position to demand anything, one of the king's representatives said coldly. Sit down, Lord Halridge, or be removed. Halridge's face went white, then red. He wasn't used to being told no, especially not publicly. These people are lying, he said, gesturing at Sarah and the other servants. I can provide witnesses who will contradict every word they've said. Then provide them, the magistrate said, clearly hoping to regain some control. Present your evidence. Halridge's eyes swept the room, calculating. Rowan could see him adjusting his strategy in real time. Very well, he said smoothly. But first, I think it's important that everyone here understands the full context of this situation. He turned to face Lyra directly. The Duchess has personal reasons for attacking me. You see, 3 years ago, I made an offer of marriage to her. It was generous, honorable. Her father was in favor, but she refused, and when I wouldn't accept that refusal gracefully, she manufactured lies about me to justify her rejection. Lyra's face went very still. That's not true, she said quietly. Isn't it? You created rumors about your own disfigurement to avoid marrying me. You hid yourself away rather than accept an alliance that would have elevated your entire family. And now, married to a desperate duke drowning in debt, you've concocted this elaborate scheme to destroy me in revenge. The whispers started immediately. Rowan could see doubt creeping into some faces. Halridge was good at this, twisting truth just enough to make lies sound plausible. I have witnesses who will testify that Lady Blackthorn's accusations against me are motivated by spite, not truth, Halridge continued. I have documentation showing that Duke Blackthorn's debts are far worse than admitted, that this marriage was a transaction designed to save him from ruin, and I have proof that every servant here was paid handsomely to provide false testimony. That's a lie, Sarah Whitmore said, standing. We were paid nothing. Sit down, Halridge snapped, his mask slipping for just a moment. But that moment was enough. Rowan saw it. The king's representatives saw it. The entire room saw the predator beneath the polish. Interesting, one of the representatives said. You claim these are lies, yet you seem very invested in silencing the accusers. Halridge recovered quickly, his pleasant mask sliding back into place. I'm simply defending my reputation against coordinated slander. Then you won't object to a formal investigation, the other representative said, including examination of all relevant records and, as Duke Blackthorn suggested, exhumation of your first wife's body. The room went silent. Halridge's jaw worked. That's unnecessary, disturbing the dead for no reason. There is reason, the magistrate interrupted, finally finding his spine. Multiple witnesses have provided credible testimony suggesting foul play. The Crown has a duty to investigate. This is persecution. Halridge's voice rose. I have connections, influence, which is precisely why we will investigate thoroughly, the first representative said, to ensure justice is done without favoritism. Rowan watched Halridge's world fracture in real time. The man's confidence crumbled, replaced by something desperate and dangerous. If that's the court's decision, then I invoke my right to trial by combat, Halridge said suddenly. The words dropped like a bomb. What? The magistrate said. It's an ancient right, but it's still law, Halridge said, his eyes locked on Rowan. If the Duke believes his accusations are true, let him prove it with his blade. If he wins, I submit to investigation. If I win, all charges are dropped, and these witnesses are charged with perjury." "That's barbaric," Lyra said. "That's the law," Halridge countered, "unless your husband is too cowardly to back his words with action." The challenge hung in the air. Rowan knew immediately what Halridge was doing. The man was a trained swordsman, practiced in dueling. Rowan hadn't held a sword in combat since his youth. Halridge was maneuvering to eliminate the threat personally, to silence the accusations with Rowan's blood. Smart, brutal, probably effective. "I accept," Rowan said. "No." Lyra grabbed his arm. "This is insane. He's going to kill you." "Maybe," Rowan said quietly. "But if I refuse, he'll use it to discredit everything we've built here. He'll say I'm a coward making accusations I can't defend." "Then let someone else fight for you. Hire a champion." "The law requires the accuser to fight personally," Halridge said, smiling coldly, "or withdraw the accusations entirely." Rowan looked at Lyra, seeing the fear in her eyes. Fear for him. It did something to his chest, made it hard to breathe. "I have to do this," he said. "You'll die. Then I'll die knowing I fought instead of surrendered." The magistrate was conferring with the king's representatives, clearly trying to find a way out of this. But Halridge was right. Trial by combat was still technically legal, a relic from older times that had never been formally abolished. "The combat will take place at dawn tomorrow," the magistrate announced reluctantly. "In the courtyard. First blood or surrender determines the victor." "First death," Halridge corrected. "Winner takes all." "That's not—" "Those are the traditional terms," Halridge insisted, "unless the Duke wishes to negotiate different conditions." Rowan met his eyes. He saw death there, confident and patient. "First death," he agreed. The crowd erupted. The hearing dissolved into chaos. People fled the hall, eager to spread the news that Duke Blackthorn and Lord Halridge would fight to the death at dawn. Lyra pulled Rowan aside as soon as they could escape the crowd. "This is suicide," she said, her voice shaking with fury and fear. "You've never fought a real duel. Halridge has killed 3 men in sanctioned combat. He's going to cut you down in front of everyone." "Probably." "Then why?" "Because some things are worth dying for," Rowan said. "And you're one of them." Lyra's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't ask you to die for me." "I know, but I'm choosing it anyway." He pulled her close, holding her while she shook with anger and grief. "There has to be another way," she whispered against his chest. "If there is, we'll find it," Rowan promised. "But right now, we have until dawn to prepare." They spent the night in the armory. Rowan selected a sword, not the ornate ceremonial blade his father had left him, but a practical weapon meant for actual fighting. It felt heavy and unfamiliar in his hand. Lyra worked beside him, stripping away any advantage Halridge might have through trickery. She checked the blade for flaws, examined the balance, ensured nothing could be used against them. "I'm not a swordsman," Rowan admitted, practicing basic forms. "I can hold a blade, but against someone skilled—" "Then don't fight like a swordsman," Lyra said. "Fight like someone with nothing to lose." "That's not a technique. It's the only technique that matters." She moved to stand in front of him. "Halridge will fight with arrogance. He thinks he's already won. Use that. Be unpredictable. Be willing to take damage to deal damage." "That's suicide." "No," Lyra corrected. "Suicide is fighting his fight. You need to make him fight yours." She drilled him on dirty tactics, strikes that weren't elegant but were effective, ways to use terrain and momentum when skill failed. It wasn't pretty, but it gave him options. As the night wore on and dawn approached, Rowan felt a strange calm settle over him. He might die in a few hours. Probably would, if he was being honest. But he'd die having fought for something that mattered. He'd die having stood up to a predator instead of cowering. And he'd die knowing that Lyra had been worth every risk, every gamble, every moment of the brief time they'd had together. "Whatever happens," he said as the first light appeared on the horizon, "you keep fighting. Use whatever evidence you have. Make sure those servants are protected. Don't let Halridge win." "He won't win," Lyra said fiercely, "because you're not going to die." Lyra, "No, listen to me." She grabbed his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You're going to survive this. You're going to beat him. And then we're going to tear apart everything he's built and watch it burn." Rowan wanted to believe her, but reality was a blade that cut through hope. The courtyard filled as dawn broke. It seemed half the region had turned out to watch the spectacle. The magistrate and king's representatives sat at a raised platform, looking grim. Sarah Whitmore and the other servants stood together, their faces pale but determined. Halridge arrived dressed in fighting leathers, his sword already drawn. He moved with the confidence of a man who'd done this before and won. Rowan stood across from him in simple clothes, his borrowed sword feeling like dead weight in his hand. The magistrate read the formal terms. First death. No intervention. The winner's position would be considered proven by divine judgment, an archaic principle that made Rowan want to laugh bitterly. Any last words? Halridge asked, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Just one, Rowan replied. When this is over, they're going to dig up your wife's body, and everyone will know what you are. Halridge's smile turned vicious. You won't be alive to see it. The magistrate raised his hand. Begin. Halridge moved first, fast and precise. His blade cut through the air where Rowan's head had been a moment before. Rowan stumbled back, barely parrying the second strike. The crowd gasped. Halridge pressed forward, his attacks coming in practiced combinations that drove Rowan backward across the courtyard. Each parry sent shockwaves through Rowan's arms. Each step back brought him closer to the wall. Pathetic, Halridge said, circling. Did you really think you could challenge me? Rowan didn't waste breath on a response. He focused on staying alive, on reading Halridge's patterns, on finding any opening he could exploit. There, a slight overextension on the backswing, a moment where Halridge's confidence made him sloppy. Rowan struck, putting everything he had into a wild slash that caught Halridge across the forearm. First blood. But the rules said first death, and the cut was shallow. Halridge looked down at his arm, then back at Rowan, and something cold entered his eyes. Clever, he said, but not clever enough. The next attack was brutal. Halridge abandoned elegance for pure aggression, raining down blows that Rowan could barely block. His sword arm screamed in protest. His muscles burned. A strike got through his guard, opening a gash across his ribs. Pain exploded through his side. The crowd roared. Rowan fell to one knee, gasping. Blood soaked through his shirt. Halridge stood over him, sword raised for the killing blow. Any last? Lyra's voice cut through the air. Stop! Everyone froze. She stood at the edge of the courtyard, holding a document above her head. I have new evidence, she announced. Evidence that changes everything. The duel cannot be interrupted, Halridge snarled. It's not a duel anymore, one of the king's representatives said, standing. What evidence, Lady Blackthorn? Lyra crossed the courtyard, moving past Halridge without looking at him, and handed the document to the representative. He read it. His face went white. This is... Where did you get this? From the vault at Halridge's estate, Lyra said, delivered by a servant who couldn't stay silent anymore. That's theft, Halridge shouted. It's a signed confession, Lyra said calmly, written by your second wife days before she died, describing in detail how you poisoned her, how you'd threatened to do the same to her family if she didn't comply. She hid it, hoping someone would find it eventually and bring you to justice. The courtyard erupted. Halridge's face went from red to purple. That's a forgery. It's witnessed and notarized, the king's representative said, his voice cutting through the chaos. And it matches other documents in our possession. He looked at Halridge with disgust. This duel is over. Lord Halridge, you are under arrest for murder. You can't. I have rights. You have the right to trial, the magistrate said, finally showing some backbone. Guards. But Halridge was already moving. He lunged toward Lyra, his sword aimed at her heart. Rowan moved without thinking. Pain, exhaustion, blood loss. None of it mattered. He threw himself between Halridge and Lyra, taking the blade meant for her straight through his shoulder. The impact drove him backward. He and Halridge crashed to the ground together, rolling in the dirt. Rowan's sword fell from his numb fingers. Halridge raised his blade for another strike, and Lyra drove a knife into his back. The courtyard went silent. Halridge looked down at the blade protruding from his chest, surprise written across his face. He tried to speak, coughed blood instead, and collapsed. Lyra stood over him, her face splattered with his blood, the knife still in her hand. That's for Margaret, she said quietly, and every other woman you destroyed. Then she dropped the knife and fell to her knees beside Rowan. You idiot, she sobbed, pressing her hands against his wounds. "You beautiful, brave idiot." "Worth it," Rowan gasped. Blood filled his mouth. "You're safe now." "Don't you dare die on me," Lyra said fiercely. "Don't you dare." But darkness was already pulling at the edges of his vision. The last thing he saw before the world went black was her face, fierce and beautiful and alive. And he smiled. Pain dragged Rowan back to consciousness like hooks through flesh. He woke to whiteness, ceiling, walls, bandages wrapped so tight around his chest and shoulder he could barely breathe. The room smelled of antiseptic and something herbal he couldn't place. Daylight filtered through curtains he didn't recognize. "Don't move," Lyra's voice. He turned his head, slowly, because everything hurt, and found her sitting in a chair beside the bed. She looked terrible. Dark circles under her eyes, her hair tangled, her dress the same blood-stained one she'd been wearing in the courtyard. How long had she been sitting there? "How long?" he croaked, his throat raw. 3 days, she said. "The doctor said you'd either wake up or die. You're too stubborn to die." "Halridge?" "Dead. Buried in an unmarked grave outside the region. The king's representatives ruled it justifiable defense. He attacked first. You took the blow meant for me. I stopped the threat." Her voice was flat, mechanical, like she'd repeated this explanation so many times it had lost all meaning. Rowan tried to sit up. Agony lanced through his shoulder and he gasped, falling back against the pillows. "I said don't move," Lyra snapped, but she was already on her feet, adjusting his position with practiced efficiency. The blade went clean through, missed the major blood vessels by a finger's width. "You're lucky to be alive, and lucky you'll keep the arm." "Doesn't feel lucky." "No, I imagine it doesn't." She settled back into her chair and Rowan noticed her hands were shaking. She clasped them together tightly to hide it, but he'd seen. "You haven't slept," he said. "Neither have you." "I've been unconscious. That's different." "Is it?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You nearly died, Rowan. Your heart stopped twice on the operating table. The doctor said if the blade had been an inch to the left." Her voice broke. Rowan reached out with his good arm, fumbling until he found her hand. Her fingers closed around his so tightly it hurt. "But it wasn't," he said quietly. "I'm here. You're here. We survived. We killed a man." "I killed a man," Rowan corrected. "You defended yourself and me. There's a difference." "The law agrees with you. Doesn't change what I did." She looked down at their joined hands. "I stabbed him in the back and I watched him bleed out, and I felt nothing but satisfaction. What does that make me?" "Human," Rowan said. "It makes you human." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "I keep seeing his face. Not when he died. When he threatened you. When he aimed that blade at me and you stepped in front of it without hesitation. You could have let him kill me, solved all your problems at once. Don't be stupid. I'm serious. You barely knew me. We'd been married less than 2 weeks. Letting me die would have freed you from Halridge's attention, kept your estate safe, and destroyed everything I decided to be when I married you," Rowan interrupted. "I told you I wouldn't hand you over. I meant it." Lyra lifted her eyes to his face. "You're an idiot. You've mentioned that. A brave, ridiculous idiot who nearly got himself killed for someone who lied to you from the beginning. You didn't lie. You just didn't tell me everything. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes." Rowan squeezed her hand. "And I'd do it again, take that blade again, step in front of you again, every time." Her breath hitched. Tears tracked down her cheeks, cutting clean paths through the grime and exhaustion. "I thought you were dead," she whispered. "When you collapsed in the courtyard with blood everywhere, I thought I'd lost you." "Takes more than one sword to kill me, apparently." She laughed and cried at the same time, a broken sound that made his chest ache worse than the wound. "You need to sleep," he said. "I need to make sure you don't die while I'm not looking." "I won't. Mrs. Brennan would never forgive me." That got another wet laugh. Lyra wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks across her face. "The world's been busy while you were unconscious," she said, clearly trying to regain some composure. "The king's representatives ordered Halridge's estates and assets frozen pending investigation. They exhumed Margaret's body. The physician confirmed signs of strangulation, not writing injuries. Sarah Whitmore and the others gave full depositions that are being sent to the Capitol." What about his allies, his political connections? Scattering like rats from a fire. Turns out nobody wants to be associated with a confirmed murderer. Edmund Caro fled the region entirely. There's a warrant out for his arrest as an accomplice. The magistrate resigned in disgrace for taking bribes to ignore evidence. And us? Lyra's expression shifted to something complicated. We're heroes, apparently. The couple who stood up to a monster when everyone else looked away. There are ballads being written. Truly terrible ballads with questionable rhyme schemes. You're joking. I wish I were. Mrs. Brennan chased 3 minstrels off the property yesterday. Despite everything, Rowan found himself smiling, then wincing because smiling pulled at his bandages. What about Halridge's victims, the women he destroyed? We found 7 we could confirm, another dozen who might be. The King's Council is establishing a fund from Halridge's seized assets to provide them restitution. It won't undo what was done, but it's something. That's your doing. I suggested it, Lyra admitted. The representatives were receptive. Turns out they don't like the idea of powerful men thinking they can get away with murder. Rowan studied her face. She looked different somehow, older maybe, or just more settled, like she'd been carrying a weight for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight, and now that it was gone she was still adjusting to the change. You should rest, he said again. I will, after you eat something. Doctor's orders, you need to rebuild your strength. I'm not hungry. I don't care, you're eating. She stood and moved to the door, calling for Mrs. Brennan. The housekeeper appeared with startling speed, carrying a tray of broth and bread that suggested she'd been waiting for exactly this moment. About time you woke up, Mrs. Brennan said, setting the tray down with a clatter. Whole Manor's been holding its breath waiting to see if you'd live or die. Sorry to keep you in suspense, Rowan managed. Don't apologize to me. Apologize to your wife, who hasn't left this room except to use the privy for 3 days straight. Lyra's face flushed. Mrs. Brennan, it's true and you know it. Girl's been wearing herself to nothing keeping vigil. Now that you're awake, maybe she'll actually sleep in a bed instead of that chair. Mrs. Brennan left before Lyra could formulate a response. She's not wrong, Rowan said. She's meddling. She cares about you. Lyra sat back down, picking up the bowl of broth. Open your mouth. I can feed myself. You can barely lift your arm. Open. They bickered through the meal, Rowan insisting he was fine, Lyra insisting he was an idiot. It felt normal in a way nothing had felt normal in weeks, like they were an actual married couple instead of 2 strangers bound by desperation. When the bowl was empty, Lyra set it aside and finally allowed herself to lean back in the chair, exhaustion catching up with her all at once. Sleep, Rowan said. I'm not going anywhere. Promise? Promise. She nodded, her eyes already closing. Within minutes, her breathing evened out into sleep, the deep, dreamless kind that came from complete exhaustion. Rowan watched her sleep and tried to process everything that had happened. A week ago, he'd been a failing duke entering a loveless marriage. Now he was a man who'd nearly died protecting his wife, who'd helped expose a murderer, who'd somehow become a symbol of resistance against corrupt power. It felt surreal. It felt right. The door opened quietly and one of the king's representatives, Lord Ashford, Rowan remembered, stepped inside. He looked surprised to find Rowan awake. Duke Blackthorn, I didn't expect you to be conscious yet. Apparently I'm stubborn, Ashford smiled slightly. So I've heard. I won't keep you long. You need rest. But there are matters that require discussion. What matters? The representative pulled up another chair, glancing at Lyra's sleeping form before speaking quietly. The investigation into Halridge's activities has uncovered a network of corruption far more extensive than we initially believed. Magistrates taking bribes, tax collectors looking the other way, even members of the Economic Council protecting his interests in exchange for favors. How extensive? At least 40 officials across 5 counties, maybe more. The rot goes deep. Rowan felt a chill that had nothing to do with his injuries. You're saying Halridge wasn't operating alone. He was the center of a web. And now that center is gone, the web is collapsing, but slowly. Some of his allies are trying to protect themselves by destroying evidence. Others are attempting to seize his assets before they can be properly accounted for. What do you need from me? Ashford leaned forward. Testimony. Documentation. You and your wife have proven yourselves both brave and incorruptible. Rare qualities. The king wants a full accounting of what happened here, and he wants people he can trust to help root out the remaining corruption. We're not investigators. No, but you're victims who fought back successfully. That matters. People will listen to you in a way they won't listen to official inquiries. Rowan looked at Lyra again. She'd fought so hard to escape Howridge's shadow. Did he have the right to drag her back into it, even for justice? I'll need to discuss this with my wife, he said. Of course. Take your time to recover, but know that your assistance would be invaluable, and the king remembers those who serve him well. The implication was clear. Help with this investigation, and royal favor would follow. Protection, influence, maybe even financial support to fully restore Blackthorn Manor. It was everything Rowan had needed when he'd entered that arranged marriage. The irony wasn't lost on him. After Ashford left, Rowan lay in the quiet room watching light move across the ceiling. His shoulder throbbed, his ribs ached. Every breath reminded him how close he'd come to dying. But he was alive. Lyra was alive. And Howridge was dead. The door opened again, quieter this time. Sarah Whitmore stepped inside, moving with the careful silence of someone used to being invisible. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace," she said softly. "I wanted to see how you were faring." "Better than expected," Rowan said. "How are you, and the others?" Sarah's expression flickered, surprise that he'd ask, maybe, or just unfamiliarity with being asked at all. "We're well. The representatives have offered us positions in the new household staff they're establishing to manage Howridge's seized estates. Good wages, safe conditions. It's more than we dared hope for." "You deserve it. Your testimony made the difference." "No." Sarah shook her head firmly. "Your wife made the difference. She listened when we came forward. She protected us. She stood up when everyone else looked away." She glanced at Lyra. "You're lucky to have her." "I know." Sarah moved closer, lowering her voice. "There's something you should know. When Lady Margaret was dying, she told me something. She said that someday someone would stop him. Someone brave enough and angry enough and desperate enough. She said when that person came, I should help them, no matter the cost." "You think she meant Lyra?" "I think she meant both of you." Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Margaret would be glad, I think, to know that her death wasn't the end of his evil, that eventually someone fought back and won." After she left, Rowan found himself thinking about Margaret Howridge, about all the women who'd suffered and died because one man had power and no conscience, about how close Lyra had come to being another name on that list. The rage that filled him was cold and focused. Howridge was dead, but his legacy remained. The systems that had protected him, the people who'd enabled him, the culture that had made women like Lyra and Margaret disposable. That needed to change. When Lyra woke hours later, blinking groggily in the lamplight, Rowan was ready. "Lord Ashford came by," he said. "The king wants our help investigating Howridge's network." She sat up, instantly alert. "What kind of help? Testimony? Documentation? Being public faces for the investigation?" "That's dangerous. Everything's dangerous, Lyra rubbed her eyes. "True. What did you tell him?" "That I needed to discuss it with you first." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stood and moved to the window, staring out at the dark grounds. "I spent 3 years hiding," she said quietly. "Running from threats, manipulating perception, trying to make myself too small to notice. It worked. I survived. But I'm tired of surviving by becoming invisible." "You don't have to do this," Rowan said. "We could refuse, rebuild our lives quietly, let someone else handle the investigation. Could we?" She turned to face him. "Could you actually walk away knowing there are 40 more officials out there still protecting each other, still enabling the next Howridge?" "No," Rowan admitted. "Probably not." "Then we don't have a choice." "Not really. There's always a choice." Lyra crossed back to the bed and sat on the edge, careful not to jostle his injuries. "You nearly died protecting me. The least I can do is stand beside you while we finish what we started." "This isn't your debt to pay." "It's not about debt. It's about deciding what kind of people we want to be." She took his hand. "Do we want to be survivors who hide or fighters who push back?" "Fighters," Rowan said. "I want to be fighters." "Then we tell Ashford yes. We testify. We document. We drag every corrupt official into the light. and watch them burn. It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. They sat together in the lamplight, two people who'd been strangers a month ago and now understood each other better than most couples married for years. "We should probably actually talk about the marriage," Lyra said eventually. "What about it?" "About what it means now. We entered it as a transaction. Your title for my money, mutual protection from Halridge. But that's done now. The contracts are fulfilled. We could annul if you wanted. Go our separate ways." Rowan's chest tightened. "Is that what you want?" "I'm asking what you want." He considered lying, playing it safe, protecting himself from potential rejection. But they'd promised honesty, and he wasn't going to break that now. "I want you to stay," he said, "not because of contracts or necessity or protection, but because I choose you. Because you're brilliant and fierce, and you make me want to be better than I was. Because when I thought I was dying, the only thing I regretted was that we wouldn't have more time together." Lyra's breath caught. "Rowan, you don't have to answer now. You don't have to answer at all if you're not ready. But that's what I want. You, here, building something real together." She was quiet for so long he thought he'd miscalculated, pushed too hard, too fast. Then she leaned down and kissed him, gentle this time, mindful of his injuries, but no less intense for the care. "I choose you too," she whispered against his mouth. "You ridiculous, brave, impossible man. I choose you." Relief flooded through him so powerfully it was almost painful. "Good," he managed. "That's good." She laughed, the sound lighter than he'd ever heard from her. "Very eloquent, Your Grace." "I nearly died. I'm allowed to be inarticulate." "Fair point." They stayed like that, her sitting on the edge of the bed, him propped up against pillows, hands clasped together, until Mrs. Brennan bustled in announcing visitors. The next week brought a parade of people through Blackthorn Manor, representatives from the King's Council documenting evidence. Lawyers drawing up formal charges against Halridge's co-conspirators. Journalists from the Capitol wanting interviews about the dramatic duel and its aftermath. Rowan recovered slowly, regaining strength day by day. Lyra managed the chaos with ruthless efficiency, protecting his rest while ensuring the investigation had everything it needed. They gave their testimony together, a detailed accounting of everything from the arranged marriage to the final confrontation. The story spread across the region, then the kingdom, taking on a life of its own. The failing duke and the hidden bride who'd brought down a monster. It made for good theater, even if the reality had been messier and more desperate than the ballads suggested. 8 days after the duel, Rowan was finally strong enough to walk the grounds. Lyra accompanied him, keeping pace with his slow, careful steps. The estate looked different somehow. New staff had arrived, people Lyra had carefully vetted, who had no connection to Halridge or his network. The burned stable had been cleared and rebuilding had begun. The manor itself seemed lighter, like a weight had been lifted from its foundations. "It's strange," Rowan said, pausing to catch his breath. "A month ago, this place was falling apart, and I was drowning. Now we have money, staff, royal favor, everything I thought I needed." "But," Lyra prompted, "but none of it feels as important as surviving with you." She smiled. "You're getting better at the eloquent declarations." Practice. They continued walking, moving through gardens that were overgrown but showed signs of recent care. Someone had started clearing the weeds, pruning back dead branches. "What happens after the investigation?" Lyra asked. "After all the corruption is exposed and the guilty are punished?" "We rebuild," Rowan said. "The estate, our reputation, our lives. We figure out what kind of duchy we want to run." "We?" "We," he confirmed. "I'm not doing this alone anymore." Lyra squeezed his arm gently. "I have ideas. About the estate management, about community programs, about using our position to actually help people instead of just extracting taxes from them." "Tell me." She did, outlining plans for improved tenant housing, fair wages for estate workers, investments in local infrastructure. Her vision was ambitious and compassionate in equal measure. The perspective of someone who'd been powerless and remembered what that felt like. Rowan listened, making suggestions, asking questions, building on her ideas with his own understanding of local politics and economics. By the time they completed their circuit of the grounds and returned to the manor, they had the rough outline of a plan that would take years to implement, but might actually change lives. We're going to make mistakes, Rowan warned. We'll have setbacks and failures. Probably, Lyra agreed, but we'll figure it out together. Together, Rowan repeated, liking the sound of it. That evening, Lord Ashford returned with news from the capital. The king is pleased with your cooperation, he announced in the study, where Rowan and Lyra received him. He's issued formal commendations recognizing your bravery and service to the realm. Additionally, he's authorized a grant to restore Blackthorn Manor to its former glory, and beyond. That's generous, Rowan said carefully. It's strategic, Ashford corrected. You've become symbols of resistance against corruption. The king wants to ensure your position to continue that work, properly funded, properly supported. In exchange for? Continued assistance with the investigation, public support for the reforms being proposed to prevent this kind of abuse in the future, and eventually taking a more active role in regional governance. Rowan glanced at Lyra. She nodded slightly. We're willing to help, Rowan said. But we have conditions. Ashford raised an eyebrow. Conditions? Protection for the witnesses who came forward, permanent positions, safe housing, guarantees they won't face retaliation. Already arranged. And we want oversight on how Halridge's seized assets are distributed. Some should go to his victims, yes, but some should fund systemic reforms that prevent the next predator from operating unchecked. That's ambitious. That's necessary, Lyra said firmly. Halridge didn't operate in a vacuum. He had enablers at every level. Those systems need to change, or we'll just be fighting the next monster in 10 years. Ashford studied them both for a long moment. Then he smiled, genuine this time, not the political mask. The king chose well, he said. You'll have your oversight position, and your reforms. Make them count. After he left, Rowan and Lyra sat in the study staring at each other. Did we just agree to become reformers? Rowan asked. I think we did. That's going to make us enemies. More enemies, Lyra corrected. We already have plenty. True. She moved to sit beside him on the couch, tucking herself against his uninjured side. Are you having second thoughts? About which part? The investigation, the reforms, or marrying a woman who stabbed my enemy in the back? Any of it. Rowan wrapped his good arm around her. No second thoughts. This is the first time in years I've felt like I'm actually moving forward instead of just treading water. Me too, Lyra admitted quietly. I was so focused on survival, I forgot what it felt like to actually live. And now? Now I'm terrified and excited and so angry at the injustice we're going to spend years fixing. She looked up at him. But I'm not doing it alone. That makes all the difference. The next morning brought another surprise, a letter from Lyra's father. She read it in silence, her expression growing progressively colder. What does he want? Rowan asked. Reconciliation, Lyra said, the word dripping with contempt. Now that we're royal favorites, he suddenly remembers he has a daughter. He's suggesting we forgive past misunderstandings and rebuild our family relationship. What are you going to tell him? Lyra folded the letter carefully, then walked to the fireplace and dropped it into the flames. Nothing, she said, watching it burn. He made his choice when he tried to sell me to Halridge. I'm done giving him opportunities to hurt me. Your mother's family? Rowan asked carefully. The inheritance she left you came from somewhere. Lyra's expression softened slightly. Different story. My mother's sister reached out last week. Wants to meet, make amends for staying silent when my father had control. I'm considering it. You should. Family that actually cares is rare, says the man whose father drank away his inheritance. Exactly. I know the value of the family you choose versus the family you're born into. Lyra came back to him, settling into the chair across from his. We're building something new here, aren't we? Not just rebuilding what was, but creating something different entirely. Yes, Rowan agreed. Something better. Or at least we're trying. That's all we can do. Try. 2 weeks after the duel, Rowan was strong enough to attend the formal hearing where charges were filed against Halridge's co-conspirators. He and Lyra sat in the public gallery watching as magistrates, tax collectors, and minor nobles were called to answer for their crimes. Some confessed immediately, hoping for leniency. Others maintained their innocence until confronted with documentation they couldn't refute. A few fled before they could be arrested. Justice moved slowly, but it moved. Sarah Whitmore testified again, joined by other former servants who'd found the courage to speak now that the immediate threat was gone. Their words painted a picture of systematic abuse enabled by people who'd looked the other way for profit or fear. The gallery was packed with observers, common people who'd never been allowed in these proceedings before, watching the powerful brought low. When it was over and the accused were led away to await trial, someone in the crowd started clapping. It spread quickly, becoming thunderous applause that followed Rowan and Lyra as they left the courthouse. "They're applauding us," Lyra said, sounding surprised. "They're applauding hope," Rowan corrected. "The idea that the powerful can be held accountable, that fighting back isn't futile. No pressure then. None at all." That night, they stood on the manor's balcony looking out over lands that were finally, truly theirs. Not just legally, practically. Built on choice instead of desperation. "We won," Lyra said quietly. "We survived," Rowan corrected. "Winning is going to take a lot longer. But we're going to keep fighting." "Yes, together." She leaned against him, and he held her close, careful of his healing wounds. Below them, Blackthorn Manor settled into evening quiet. Lights glowed in windows where new staff worked. Smoke rose from chimneys. The sound of hammers from the stable reconstruction drifted on the wind. It wasn't perfect. The estate still needed work. The investigation would continue for months. They'd made powerful enemies who wouldn't forget or forgive. But for the first time since his father's death, Rowan felt something that might actually be peace. Not the peace of surrender, but the peace of knowing exactly what you were fighting for and having someone to fight beside. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For being worth fighting for fighting with me, for choosing this." He gestured at the manor, the lands, the complicated future spreading before them, when you could have chosen something easier. Lyra turned in his arms to face him. "There's nothing easy about you, Rowan Blackthorn, and I wouldn't want there to be." She kissed him as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that looked like hope burning on the horizon. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, investigations to support, reforms to implement, enemies to outmaneuver. But tonight, they had this, a moment of victory hard won, a partnership forged in fire, and the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. Not as a transaction, not as strangers bound by necessity, but as equals who'd chosen each other in the worst circumstances and decided to build something better in the aftermath. The marriage that had started as a desperate gamble had become something neither had dared hope for, a real alliance built on respect and trust, and the kind of love that grew from shared battle, and that more than royal favor or restored fortunes felt like winning. The first real test came 6 weeks after Halridge's death, when Edmund Caro resurfaced. He didn't come quietly. He came with lawyers, forged documents, and a formal petition to the King's Council claiming that Halridge's estates rightfully belonged to his widow's family, meaning him. Rowan was in the manor's library reviewing tenant contracts when Mrs. Brennan brought the news, her face grim as winter. "Caro's filed a legal challenge. Says Halridge's assets should pass to blood relatives, not be seized by the crown. He's got 3 magistrates backing him." "Magistrates we haven't arrested yet," Rowan muttered, setting down his pen. "Where's Lyra?" "Meeting room. She's already pulled every document we have on Caro's finances." Of course she had. Rowan found his wife surrounded by papers, her hair pulled back in a practical braid, ink staining her fingers. She looked up when he entered, and he saw the familiar sharp focus that meant she was already 3 moves ahead. "He's making a play for legitimacy," she said without preamble. "If he can position himself as Halridge's legal heir instead of an accomplice, he might escape prosecution entirely. Can he win? Depends on how corrupt the remaining magistrates are." Lyra tapped one particular document. "But I found something. Caro's been moving money, large amounts, into accounts under his wife's maiden name. Started the day after Halridge died. He's trying to hide assets before they can be seized." "Exactly. And if we can prove he's actively concealing evidence, we can have him arrested for obstruction before his petition even gets heard." Rowan moved to stand beside her, scanning the financial records. "How did you get these?" "Remember that clerk who testified? His nephew works at the bank Caro uses. He's sympathetic to our cause." "That's technically illegal." "So is murder," Lyra replied flatly. "We can be precious about method, Or we can win. Pick one. She was right, and they both knew it. Fighting people like Caro meant getting your hands dirty. Not as dirty as they got, but dirty enough to match them. We need to move fast, Rowan said, before he realizes we're onto him. Already ahead of you. Lyra stood, gathering the documents. I sent word to Lord Ashford this morning. He's bringing King's guards to arrest Caro within the hour. Without asking me first? She met his eyes directly. Would you have said no? No. Then I saved us an argument. Despite the tension, Rowan felt himself smile. This was what partnership looked like. Not perfect agreement, but aligned goals and enough trust to act decisively. You're terrifying, he said. You've mentioned that before. Bears repeating. The arrest happened at noon, in the middle of the town square where Caro was holding court with his bought magistrates. The king's guards surrounded them before they could react, and Lord Ashford read the charges in a voice that carried to every corner of the watching crowd. Obstruction of justice, concealment of evidence, conspiracy to defraud the crown. Caro tried to bluster, tried to invoke his connections and threaten legal consequences. But the crowd that had gathered wasn't sympathetic. They'd heard the stories about Halridge, about the corruption that had rotted through their region for years. They wanted blood. Not literally, though a few voices called for it, but they wanted accountability, justice, proof that the powerful couldn't just buy their way out of consequences. When Caro was led away in chains, someone started cheering. Others joined in. By the time the guard's carriage disappeared down the road toward the capital, the entire square was celebrating. Rowan and Lyra watched from the manor's gates, far enough to avoid the spectacle but close enough to see it unfold. That's one down, Lyra said quietly. 39 to go. We can't arrest all of them. Some will have covered their tracks too well. Then we'll ruin them other ways, exposure, public shame, making it impossible for them to operate the way they used to. That's a long campaign. Good thing we're in this for the long term. Rowan took her hand, threading their fingers together. Are we? In this for the long term? Lyra looked at him, her expression softening. You still doubt that? No, I just like hearing you say it. Then yes, we're in this for the long term. You're stuck with me, Rowan Blackthorn. Could be worse. Could be much worse, she agreed. The following weeks brought a cascade of developments. 3 more of Halridge's co-conspirators were arrested. 2 fled the region entirely. 5 resigned their positions rather than face investigation. The system was bleeding corruption like a lanced wound, and Rowan and Lyra were the ones holding the blade. But it wasn't easy, and it wasn't clean. Death threats arrived weekly. Anonymous letters promising violence if they didn't back down. Someone poisoned the manor's well, forcing them to bring water from town until it could be cleaned and blessed. A fire was set in the newly rebuilt stable, though they caught it before it spread. The attacks were frightening, but they were also clumsy, desperate. The work of people who'd lost their careful control and were lashing out wildly. They're scared, Lyra said one night, standing guard while Rowan inspected the scorched stable wall. Good. Scared people make mistakes. Scared people also get reckless. Let them. We're ready. And they were. Guards now patrolled the grounds day and night. Servants were carefully vetted and rotated to prevent infiltration. Food was tasted before serving. Doors were locked and bolted. It felt like living under siege, but Rowan had learned something important during these months. Sometimes survival meant accepting discomfort. Being safe mattered more than being comfortable. The turning point came 3 months after Halridge's death, when the king himself summoned them to the capital. The journey took 4 days by carriage with armed escort. Lyra spent most of it reviewing documents and preparing arguments, while Rowan tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Royal favor was a fickle thing. They'd been useful so far, but usefulness had limits. If the king decided their crusade against corruption was becoming more trouble than it was worth, they could find themselves abandoned, or worse. Stop brooding, Lyra said without looking up from her papers. I can hear you thinking from here. I'm not brooding. I'm strategizing. You're catastrophizing. There's a difference. How can you tell? You get this line right here. She tapped the space between his eyebrows. When you're imagining worst-case scenarios. Rowan rubbed at the spot self-consciously. I don't do that. You absolutely do. And right now you're convinced the king is going to strip our titles and exile us to some frozen wasteland. That's not... Rowan stopped. That's exactly what I was thinking. Lyra finally looked up, her expression amused. The king invited us to the capital. If he wanted us gone, he'd have just ordered it. This is theater. He wants to be seen supporting us publicly. Or he wants to distance himself from us publicly. Always the optimist. Someone has to balance your terrifying confidence. She laughed and went back to her documents, but she shifted closer so their shoulders touched. The contact was grounding, a reminder that whatever happened, they'd face it together. The capital was overwhelming after months in the countryside. Too many people, too much noise, buildings stacked so high they blocked out the sky. Rowan had visited twice in his youth and hated it both times. Nothing had changed. They were housed in a guest wing of the royal palace, rooms so ornate they felt more like museum displays than living spaces. Everything was gilded, carved, polished to a mere shine. It was beautiful and sterile and deeply uncomfortable. I hate it here, Rowan muttered, trying to figure out which of the 6 forks at dinner was meant for which course. It's temporary, Lyra replied, perfectly at ease despite never having been to court before. We make our appearance, we get the king's public endorsement, we go home. You make it sound simple. The concept is simple. The execution will be exhausting and full of people trying to manipulate us. But we've handled worse. The royal audience was scheduled for the next morning. Rowan barely slept, running through possible scenarios and responses until Lyra finally threw a pillow at his head. Stop it. You're going to be fine. How do you know? Because you're too stubborn to fail. She pulled him down beside her. And because I'll be right there with you. We do this together, remember? Together, Rowan echoed, letting the words settle his nerves. The throne room was exactly as oppressive as Rowan remembered. Massive and cold, designed to make petitioners feel small. The king sat elevated on a throne of carved oak and precious metals, flanked by advisors and guards. Courtiers lined the walls, their faces carefully neutral masks hiding whatever scheming happened beneath. Rowan and Lyra were announced with full titles and honors, their names echoing off marble columns. They walked forward together, stopping at the prescribed distance and bowing in perfect synchronization. The king was younger than Rowan expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and the kind of stillness that suggested a mind constantly calculating. Duke Blackthorn, Duchess Blackthorn, rise. They straightened. We have followed your efforts with great interest, the king said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. The exposure of Lord Halridge's crimes, the subsequent investigation into corruption within our regional governance, remarkable work. We serve the crown, Your Majesty, Rowan replied, keeping his voice steady. Do you? Or do you serve justice? The king leaned forward slightly. There is sometimes a difference. It was a test. Rowan knew it immediately. The wrong answer could mean disaster. But Lyra spoke before he could formulate a careful response. We serve both, Your Majesty. Justice serves the crown by ensuring that power is wielded with integrity rather than abused for personal gain. A corrupt system undermines royal authority as surely as any rebellion. Silence filled the throne room. Then the king smiled, genuine amusement flickering across his features. Well said, Duchess. You have the mind of a politician. I have the mind of someone who's survived powerful men trying to destroy me, Lyra corrected. It teaches clarity. Murmurs rippled through the courtiers. You didn't speak to the king with that kind of directness. You certainly didn't correct him. But the king's smile widened. Indeed, and that survival has made you both valuable to the realm. He stood, and everyone in the room immediately bowed. We hereby grant you full authority to continue your investigation with Crown support. Any official who obstructs your work will answer directly to us. Any magistrate who refuses your evidence will be removed from office. Rowan felt his breath catch. This was more than endorsement. This was actual power. Additionally, the king continued, we are establishing a new position, Royal Commissioners for Regional Integrity. You will be the first to hold this title, with mandate to investigate corruption and abuse of power throughout our realm. You will report directly to the crown and have authority to act in our name. The throne room erupted in whispers. This was unprecedented. The king had just given 2 minor nobles the power to investigate anyone, anywhere, with royal backing. Rowan exchanged a glance with Lyra. She looked as stunned as he felt. "Your Majesty," Rowan managed, "we are honored, but surely such authority concerns you?" The king's expression turned sharp. "It should. This power can be used for great good or terrible harm. We trust you understand the difference." "We do, Your Majesty." "Then accept our commission, use it wisely, and remember that with royal favor comes royal scrutiny. Disappoint us, and the consequences will be severe." "We understand," Lyra said clearly, "and we accept." The king nodded once, dismissing them with a gesture. They backed out of the throne room according to protocol, heads spinning with the magnitude of what had just happened. Outside in the corridor, they finally stopped and looked at each other. "Did that actually just happen?" Rowan asked. "I think so. We have authority to investigate anyone in the realm. Apparently. We're going to make so many enemies." Lyra started laughing, the slightly unhinged sound of someone processing shock through humor. "We already have so many enemies. What's a few dozen more?" Rowan found himself laughing too, and then they were leaning against each other in the empty corridor, laughing until tears streamed down their faces, drunk on power and terror and the sheer absurdity of how far they'd come. 6 months ago, he'd been a failing duke entering a loveless marriage. Now he was a royal commissioner with authority to reshape corrupt systems throughout the kingdom. The universe had a twisted sense of humor. The journey home felt different. They were different. The weight of their new authority settled over them like armor, protective but heavy. "We can't do this alone," Lyra said on the third day of travel. "The mandate is too broad, the corruption too deep. We'll need help." "What kind of help?" "People we trust. Investigators, clerks, lawyers who aren't bought off. We need to build an actual organization, not just the two of us running around putting out fires." Rowan considered this. "Sarah Whitmore. She's smart, organized, knows how Halridge's network operated." "Perfect. And the clerk who testified. He's dying, but he has months left. He could train others in document analysis." "Mrs. Brennan's nephew for records access. And we'll need someone who understands finance, someone who can trace money through shell companies and hidden accounts." They spent the rest of the journey planning, building the structure of what would become the Commission for Regional Integrity. By the time they reached Blackthorn Manor, they had a rough organization mapped out. It would take money, time, and enormous effort, but for the first time they had the resources and authority to actually do it. The manor had changed in their absence. The reconstruction was complete. New stable, repaired roofs, fresh paint on shutters that had been rotting when they left. The grounds showed signs of careful tending, gardens cleared and replanted. It looked like a home instead of a crumbling monument to past glory. Mrs. Brennan met them at the entrance, her stern face softening into something almost like pride. "About time you returned. Place has been too quiet without you stirring up trouble." "We brought more trouble back with us," Lyra warned, handing over her traveling cloak. "Royal Commission, investigative authority, enough work to keep us busy for years." "Of course you did," Mrs. Brennan sniffed. "I'll have rooms prepared for whatever army you're planning to assemble." News of their royal appointment spread quickly. Within days, people began arriving at the manor. Former servants of corrupt nobles willing to testify, lawyers who'd been blacklisted for refusing to falsify documents, magistrates who'd been forced out for being too honest. Sarah Whitmore arrived with 3 other women who'd survived Halridge's attention. They wanted to help ensure no one else suffered the way they had. The dying clerk came with a trunk full of documents he'd secretly copied over the years, evidence of fraud and manipulation spanning decades. Even some local gentry showed up, offering support and information about corruption they'd witnessed, but been too afraid to report. The manor transformed from a quiet estate into the headquarters of something larger. A movement, maybe, or just the beginning of actual accountability. Rowan and Lyra worked 18-hour days organizing it all, creating systems for documenting evidence, vetting informants, coordinating with royal authorities. It was exhausting and exhilarating and terrifying, but it was also working. 3 months after their royal commission, they documented corruption in 7 counties. 5 nobles had been stripped of titles and lands. 12 magistrates had been removed from office. Dozens of lower officials faced prosecution. The rot was being cut away, slowly but surely. Not everyone was happy about it. The attack came on a cold night in early spring, 6 months after Halridge's death. Rowan was working late in the study when he heard breaking glass. He was on his feet immediately, sword in hand. He'd started carrying one after the stable fire. Shouts echoed through the manor, footsteps pounding, more glass breaking. Intruders. He found Lyra in the hallway, already armed with the knife she'd used to kill Halridge. Her face was calm, but her eyes were fierce. "How many?" she asked. "Don't know. At least 4, maybe more." The guard should have stopped them at the gates. Either they'd been overwhelmed or, worse, they'd been compromised. "The documents," Lyra said. "If they destroy the evidence, I know." They moved together through the dark corridors, heading for the secured room where they kept the most sensitive materials. Behind them, they could hear the intruders ransacking rooms, searching. They reached the document room to find the door already broken open. Inside, 3 men in dark clothes were piling papers and setting them alight. Rowan didn't hesitate. He charged, catching the nearest man with a shoulder to the chest and driving him into the wall. The man's torch fell, scattering embers across the floor. Lyra went for the second intruder, her knife flashing in the firelight. She was smaller but faster, and anger made her vicious. The man fell back, clutching a slashed arm. The third intruder lunged at Rowan with a blade. They grappled, crashing into shelves that spilled more documents. Rowan's shoulder, still not fully healed, screamed in protest, but adrenaline drowned out the pain. He got his hand on the intruder's wrist, twisted hard, heard bone snap. The man screamed and dropped his weapon. Behind him, Lyra had her blade at the second intruder's throat. "Move and you die," she said calmly. The man she'd disarmed raised his hands, backing away slowly. Rowan kicked the fallen weapons out of reach and moved to stamp out the small fires before they could spread. Most of the documents were intact. They'd arrived just in time. The manor guards finally appeared, looking shaken and furious. Their captain had a bleeding head wound. "They came over the east wall," he explained. "Hit us from behind before we could raise the alarm. I'm sorry, Your Grace." "Save it," Rowan said. Just secure these 3 and find any others." The search turned up 2 more intruders trying to flee through the gardens. All 5 were locked in the cellar until morning, when they could be properly questioned. Lyra and Rowan spent the rest of the night cataloging the damage. Some documents had been burned, but most were recoverable. The intruders had been after specific files, evidence connected to 3 nobles who were scheduled to face trial the following month. "Someone's getting desperate," Lyra said, sorting through singed papers. "Or we're getting too effective." "Same thing, really." By dawn, the manor was secure again, and the intruders were being transported to the capital for interrogation. Rowan suspected they'd been hired muscle with no direct knowledge of who'd paid them, but even confirming that would be useful. As the sun rose over Blackthorn Manor, Rowan stood in the courtyard watching the guard rotation change. New faces, all carefully vetted, loyal because they believed in what the manor represented now: accountability, justice, change. Lyra joined him, her hair loose and her face smudged with soot from the fire. "We should sleep," she said. "Probably. But we won't." "No." She leaned against him and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Taking me on. Fighting this fight. We could have taken the money and disappeared. Lived quietly somewhere else." "Not once," Rowan said. "Do you?" "No. But I wonder sometimes if we're being stupid. If we're going to get ourselves killed for a cause that's bigger than we can handle. Maybe, but we're doing it together, and that makes it worth the risk." She tilted her head to look up at him. "When did you become an optimist?" "When I married a woman who taught me that fighting back was possible." Lyra smiled, the real smile she only showed when they were alone, without masks or guards. "We're going to change things," she said. "Not everything, not perfectly, but we're going to make it better than it was." "Yes," Rowan agreed. "We are." The trials began the following month. The king himself attended the first one, a public statement that these proceedings had royal backing. The courtroom was packed with nobles, commoners, journalists from across the kingdom. Rowan and Lyra presented their evidence methodically: documents showing fraud, testimony from victims, financial records proving corruption. The defense tried every tactic: character assassination, procedural challenges, claims of conspiracy. But the evidence was overwhelming, carefully documented, impossible to dismiss. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation: guilty on all counts. The convicted noble was stripped of title and lands, Sentenced to 20 years of labor, his assets seized to provide restitution to his victims. The courtroom erupted in cheers. It was the first of many trials. Over the following year, they prosecuted 17 cases. 13 convictions, 3 acquittals where evidence proved insufficient, 1 mistrial when a juror was caught taking bribes. Not perfect, but progress. The region began to change. New magistrates were appointed, carefully vetted, properly trained. Tax collection became transparent. Laws were enforced fairly instead of selectively. People started to believe that justice was possible, even for those without power or money. And Blackthorn Manor became a symbol, proof that resistance wasn't futile, that the corrupt could be held accountable, that change was possible. The first anniversary of their wedding arrived quietly. Rowan woke to find Lyra already awake, propped up on one elbow, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What?" he asked. "Just thinking." About how a year ago I walked into a marriage expecting nothing but survival. And now, she gestured vaguely at the room, the manor, everything they'd built. Now I have this, you, purpose, a reason to wake up angry and ready to fight. Rowan reached up to cup her face. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me." "I'm not romantic, I'm practical. You're both, and terrifying, and brilliant, and I love you." The words came out naturally, easily, like they'd been waiting for the right moment to exist. Lyra's breath caught. "You love me?" Desperately. Have for months. Was waiting for the right time to say it. "And you think first thing in the morning, before I've had tea, is the right time?" "No time is perfect. Figured I'd just say it and see what happened." Lyra was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned down and kissed him, slow and deep and thorough. "I love you too," she whispered against his mouth. "You impossible, stubborn, brave man. I love you so much it terrifies me." "Good," Rowan said. "We can be terrified together." They stayed in bed longer than they should have, wrapped around each other, talking about everything and nothing, making plans for the next trials, discussing reforms they wanted to propose, arguing about whether to expand the commission's mandate. It was ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. The comfortable intimacy of two people who knew each other completely and chose each other anyway. Eventually, duty called them back to work. There were documents to review, witnesses to prepare, evidence to organize. But that night, they threw a small celebration, just the manor staff and the core members of their investigation team. Nothing fancy, just good food and better company. Sarah Whitmore stood to make a toast. "A year ago, most of us were hiding, running, afraid to speak because we knew the cost of crossing powerful men." She looked at Rowan and Lyra. "You showed us that fighting back was possible, that justice wasn't just for the wealthy and connected. You gave us hope, and more importantly, you gave us tools to actually change things." She raised her glass. "To Duke and Duchess Blackthorn. May they continue to terrify the corrupt and inspire the rest of us." "To the Blackthorns!" everyone echoed. Rowan felt his throat tighten with emotion. A year ago, he'd been alone and failing. Now he had this, people who believed in what they were doing, who'd chosen to fight beside them. He had Lyra, who transformed from a transaction into a partner, into the person he couldn't imagine living without. He had purpose beyond survival. Later, when the celebration wound down and guests departed, Rowan and Lyra stood on the balcony overlooking the estate. "We did it," Lyra said quietly. "We survived. We fought back. We won." "We're still winning," Rowan corrected. "This isn't over." "No, but we proved it's possible. That matters." Rowan pulled her close, and she melted against him like she'd been doing this all her life instead of just 1 year. Below them, Blackthorn Manor glowed with lamplight. In the distance, they could see the village lights. People living lives that were just a little bit safer because of the work they'd done. It wasn't perfect. Corruption still existed. Powerful people still tried to abuse their positions. The fight would never be completely over. But they'd shifted the balance, proven that accountability was possible, created systems that would outlast them and continue the work. "What happens next?" Lyra asked. "We keep going, expand the commission, train more investigators, push for broader reforms. There are 6 more counties with documented corruption, and probably dozens more we haven't uncovered yet. That'll take years. Decades, probably. Good thing we're in this for the long term." Rowan smiled, remembering when she'd said those words months ago. How uncertain everything had felt then. How impossible victory had seemed. "I'm glad you chose me," he said quietly. "Back when you could have chosen anyone, anything. I'm glad it was me." "I'm glad you chose to fight instead of surrender," Lyra replied. "A lot of men would have handed me over to Halridge and saved themselves. I was never going to do that." "I know. That's why I chose you back." They stood together as stars emerged overhead. Two people who'd been strangers bound by desperation and had become something far stronger, partners, lovers, warriors fighting the same war. The marriage that had started as a transaction built on survival had transformed into something neither had dared hope for, a real partnership built on respect, trust, and love forged in fire. They'd walked into that chapel expecting nothing but cold necessity. They'd found each other instead. And together they'd proven that even in the harshest circumstances, even against impossible odds, courage and love could reshape the world. Not perfectly, not without cost, but enough to matter, enough to change lives, enough to build something better than what came before. As Blackthorn Manor settled into night around them, Rowan and Lyra held each other close and planned their next battle. Because the fight wasn't over. It would never be completely over. But they'd learned something crucial. Winning wasn't about one decisive victory. It was about showing up every day, fighting the battles that mattered, refusing to surrender even when the odds seemed impossible. It was about choosing to stand together instead of falling alone. And in the cold halls of Blackthorn Manor, where survival had once ruled everything, a new power had risen. One built not on fear or manipulation or corrupt authority, but on respect, strategy, and a bond strong enough to rewrite both their fates and the fate of everyone who came after. The predator was dead. The survivors had become warriors. And the future they were building, messy and imperfect and hard-won, was finally, truly theirs.